The CEO's daughter was drowning in a meltdown so violent that executives fled the floor. But Marcus Chun, the night janitor, saw something everyone else missed, a child who'd lost her voice and needed someone to hear her silence. The hidden camera captured what happened in the next 10 minutes, and when Victoria Westbrook reviewed the footage, she realized the invisible man cleaning her building was the only person who could save her daughter. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sound came first. A high-pitched wail that ricocheted off the marble walls of the 42nd floor like a siren, followed by the unmistakable crash of something expensive shattering against an immovable surface. Marcus Chun didn't look up from the drinking fountain he was polishing. In his 3 years working nights as a janitor at Westbrook Industries, he had learned the most valuable skill of all: selective deafness. The problems of the executives were not his problems. His problems were simpler: keep the floors clean, keep the trash emptied, keep his head down, get home to his daughter. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, and was now accompanied by a woman's voice, tight with barely controlled panic. "Please, Emma, please, sweetheart, you need to calm down. We talked about this." The words were measured, professional, but underneath them, Marcus heard something raw and familiar: exhaustion, the bone-deep kind that came from fighting a battle you were losing inch by inch, day by day. He squeezed out his cleaning cloth and moved down the hallway, away from the noise, he thought, repeating the mantra that had kept him employed and invisible: "Not my monkeys." But then came another crash, this one closer, and the wail transformed into words: "I hate you. I hate you. I hate this place. I want Daddy." The small voice cracked on the last word, dissolving into sobs that were no longer angry but utterly, devastatingly heartbroken. Marcus stopped walking. His hand tightened on the handle of his cleaning cart. He knew that sound. He had heard it 2 years ago from his own 6-year-old daughter Lily when he'd had to tell her that mommy wasn't coming back from the hospital, that her cancer had won, that it was just the two of them now. That particular flavor of grief, the kind that came from a child's shattered world, was a frequency he couldn't ignore. Against every instinct of self-preservation he had carefully cultivated, Marcus turned his cart around and pushed it toward the source of the chaos. He rounded the corner into the executive waiting area and took in the scene. A woman in her late 30s, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit that probably cost more than his monthly rent, stood in the center of a disaster zone. Her dark hair, which had likely started the evening in a sleek professional knot, now hung in disarray around her face. Her expression was a portrait of desperation barely held in check. At her feet, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old sat surrounded by the wreckage of what had once been a decorative vase, a potted plant, and the contents of someone's desk. Her face was red and blotchy, her small fists clenched in the fabric of her dress, her entire body shaking with the force of her sobs. She wasn't throwing a tantrum, she was drowning. The woman, who Marcus recognized as Victoria Westbrook, the CEO, whose name was literally on the building, noticed him for the first time. Her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and something that looked almost like relief. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "There's been an incident. I'll pay for everything. I just need to get my daughter to calm down first. She's having a difficult day." Marcus should have nodded, offered to clean up, and disappeared. That's what the old Marcus, the invisible janitor Marcus, would have done. But something in the little girl's face stopped him cold. She wasn't looking at her mother. She wasn't looking at the mess. She was staring straight ahead at nothing, her eyes unfocused, her breathing rapid and shallow. He had seen that look before, not in his daughter, but in himself, reflected in the bathroom mirror during the worst nights after his wife's death. It was the look of someone drowning on dry land. He set down his spray bottle carefully and took 2 slow steps forward, making sure his movements were visible and non-threatening. "Miss Westbrook?" His voice was quiet, respectful. "May I try something?" Victoria blinked at him as if he'd just spoken in another language. The janitor was addressing her directly, which apparently violated some unspoken rule of their carefully separated worlds. "I don't think," she began, but her words trailed off. She looked at her daughter, at the wreckage, at the digital clock on the wall that showed 9:47 p.m., and the fight seemed to drain out of her. She was a woman at the end of her rope, and Marcus could see her considering whether a janitor's help was better than no help at all. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus knelt down, still several feet away from the little girl, lowering himself to her eye level but not entering her space. He didn't look directly at her. Instead, he looked at the scattered soil from the broken plant pot, at the shards of ceramic, at the chaos. "Emma," he said softly, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. "That's a beautiful name. Do you know what it means?" The sobbing hitched just slightly. The little girl's eyes flickered toward him for a fraction of a second before returning to that 1,000-yard stare. Marcus took it as permission to continue. "It means whole, complete, universal." His voice was steady, calm, the same tone he used when Lily woke up from nightmares. "It's from an old German word. I bet your parents chose it because they wanted you to know you were their whole world." The sobbing was quieter now, replaced by ragged breathing. Emma's small hands unclenched slightly from her dress. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out something he always carried with him, a small, smooth stone, gray-blue and perfectly round, worn smooth by some ancient river. Lily had given it to him after finding it on a school field trip. She'd called it his worry stone and told him to rub it whenever he felt sad about Mommy. He held it up so Emma could see it, but he didn't offer it to her. He just let it rest in his palm. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. "It's a listening stone. When the world gets too loud, too scary, too much, you can hold it and it listens to all the big feelings so you don't have to hold them alone." He slowly, carefully set the stone on the floor between them, about halfway in the neutral space. Then he withdrew his hand. "I'm going to leave it right here. If you want it, it's yours. If you don't, that's okay too. Either way, it'll just sit there and listen." For a long moment, nothing happened. Victoria stood frozen, barely breathing, her hand pressed against her mouth. The silence stretched out, broken only by Emma's shuddering breaths. Then, with a movement so small, Marcus almost missed it, Emma's hand crept forward. Her fingers touched the edge of the stone, paused, then wrapped around it completely. The change wasn't dramatic. There was no Hollywood moment of instant transformation, but Emma's breathing began to slow, her grip on the stone tight but no longer desperate. She brought it close to her chest and held it there like a lifeline. Marcus stayed very still, waiting. He could feel Victoria's eyes on him, could sense her barely contained questions, but he kept his focus on the little girl in front of him. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 2 minutes, Emma spoke. Her voice was tiny, hoarse from crying. "It's smooth," she whispered. Marcus nodded slowly. "It is. The river worked on it for a long, long time. It used to have sharp edges, but the water was patient. It smoothed all the scary parts away." Emma looked at him then, really looked at him, and Marcus saw intelligence in those red-rimmed eyes. She was processing, connecting dots that adults had probably been too rushed or too anxious to help her find. "Is Mommy like the river?" she asked, her voice small but clearer now. "Because she's trying to smooth my sharp parts." The question landed in Marcus's chest like a physical weight. He glanced up at Victoria, whose face had gone very pale, whose eyes were now bright with unshed tears. He looked back at Emma and chose his words with the care of someone diffusing a bomb. "Your mommy loves you very much. Sometimes when grown-ups are scared or worried, they try really hard to fix things fast. But some things can't be rushed. Some things need time and patience, like the river." Emma nodded slowly, turning the stone over in her small hands. The meltdown, which had seemed unstoppable just 5 minutes ago, had dissolved into something quieter, something that felt more like grief than rage. "I miss my daddy," she said, and the words were simple and devastating. "He doesn't live with us anymore, and Mommy is always working, and I'm always alone with people I don't know, and everything is different and wrong and too loud." There was the heart of it, not a bratty child, not an out-of-control tantrum, just a little girl whose world had been turned upside down and who had no way to make sense of the pieces. Marcus understood that feeling in his bones. He had lived it. He was still, "I know," he said simply. "Change is really, really hard, and sometimes our feelings get so big that they need to come out, and they come out messy and loud and break things. That doesn't make you bad, it makes you human." Emma looked at the wreckage around her, then down at the stone in her hand. "I broke stuff," she said, a new fear creeping into her voice. "Mommy's gonna be so mad." Before Victoria could protest, Marcus spoke. "You know what? Tomorrow I'm gonna bring some special glue and we're gonna see if we can fix that vase. It's gonna have cracks, and we'll be able to see where it broke, but it'll be back together. Sometimes things that break and get fixed are even more beautiful than before because they tell a story." Victoria finally found her voice. "Emma, sweetheart, I'm not mad. I was just scared because I didn't know how to help." She moved carefully as if approaching a wild animal and knelt down beside her daughter. "I'm sorry I've been working so much. I'm sorry things have been so hard." Marcus watched as Victoria reached out and gently touched Emma's hair, and the little girl, still clutching the stone, leaned into her mother's side. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall that had been building between them. Marcus stood up quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, and began to carefully pick up the larger pieces of the broken vase. Victoria looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that looked like wonder and gratitude and confusion all mixed together. "How did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've had 3 different therapists try to reach her in the last 6 months." "How did you do that in 10 minutes? Marcus paused, a shard of ceramic in his gloved hand, and gave her a sad smile. "I didn't do anything special, I just saw her." He glanced at Emma, who was now calm, exhausted, leaning against her mother's shoulder. Sometimes that's all anyone needs, to be seen. What Marcus didn't know, what neither he nor Victoria knew in that quiet moment, was that every second of the last 10 minutes had been captured in perfect high definition by the newly installed security cameras that the building's management had placed in every hallway and waiting area just 2 weeks prior. And what the footage would show when Victoria reviewed it the next morning in shocked silence would change both of their lives forever. Marcus finished cleaning up the broken pieces in silence while Victoria held Emma, who had finally stopped crying altogether and was now simply breathing quietly, the worry stone still clutched in her small fist. He worked efficiently, his movements practiced and unobtrusive, trying to fade back into the wallpaper of invisibility that had protected him for 3 years. But he could feel Victoria's eyes on him, tracking his every movement with an intensity that made the back of his neck prickle with awareness. When the last of the debris was swept up and deposited into his trash bin, he straightened and nodded politely. "I'll finish up the rest of my rounds. Have a good evening, Miss Westbrook." He turned to leave, already feeling the familiar relief of escape, of returning to the safety of being unseen. "Wait." Victoria's voice stopped him at the edge of the waiting area. He turned back reluctantly. She had had shifted so Emma was tucked more securely against her side, the little girl's eyes now half closed with exhaustion. "What's your name?" Marcus hesitated. Names created connections, and connections created expectations, but refusing to answer would be more conspicuous than complying. "Marcus Chun," he said simply. "Well, Marcus Chun." Victoria stood up carefully, lifting Emma with her in a practiced motion that spoke of many late nights and many times carrying a sleeping child. "Thank you doesn't seem like nearly enough for what you just did, but thank you." She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Would you be willing to meet with me tomorrow? In my office, during business hours? I'd like to discuss something." Every alarm bell in Marcus's head started ringing at once. Business hours meant daylight, meant the world where he was supposed to be invisible, seeing him in full view. It meant questions he didn't want to answer, and attention he couldn't afford. "I appreciate the offer, Miss Westbrook, but I'm really just the night janitor. If there's an issue with my work, you can speak to my supervisor." Victoria's expression shifted, and for the first time, Marcus saw not the desperate mother, but the CEO, the woman who had built Westbrook Industries from a small startup into a billion-dollar company before she turned 35. "That wasn't a request about your custodial duties, Mr. Chun. That was a request for a conversation. 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'll have security put your name on the visitor list." She didn't wait for him to agree or refuse. She simply turned and carried her sleeping daughter toward the private elevator, leaving Marcus standing alone in the empty hallway with the distinct feeling that his carefully constructed invisible life had just developed a very visible crack. He went home that night to the small 2-bedroom apartment he shared with Lily in a neighborhood that was affordable specifically because no one wanted to live there. The building was old, the walls were thin, and the heat was unreliable, but it was theirs. He let himself in quietly, knowing Lily would be asleep. His neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who watched Lily in the evenings in exchange for help with her groceries and prescriptions, quote, was dozing on his couch, the television playing softly. She stirred when he entered, blinking herself awake. "Oh, Marcus, you're home." Lily was an angel as always. "We made cookies and did her homework. She's sleeping like a rock." Mrs. Rodriguez gathered her things and shuffled toward the door, then paused. "That child of yours is special. You know that, right? The way she talks about you, the way she sees the world, don't let this city grind that out of her." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever anyone talked about Lily's future, about potential, about dreams. "I won't," he promised, though he had no idea how to keep that promise on a janitor's salary in a city that ate people alive. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, he stood in the doorway of Lily's tiny bedroom and watched her sleep. She was curled up under a threadbare blanket decorated with faded unicorns, her dark hair spread across the pillow, one hand tucked under her cheek. She looked so much like her mother it hurt. He thought about Emma Westbrook, about the look in that little girl's eyes, about the way she'd reached for the stone like it was a lifeline. He thought about Victoria's face, about the desperation he'd seen there that she probably showed to no one else in her entire corporate empire. And he thought about the conversation he definitely wasn't going to show up for tomorrow morning, because getting involved with people like Victoria Westbrook was a guaranteed way to destroy the fragile peace he'd built for himself and his daughter. But sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay in his own bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and remembered a different life, a life where he hadn't been Marcus Chun the janitor, but Marcus Chun the child psychologist, a man who'd built a small practice helping troubled kids and their families navigate trauma, divorce, anxiety, and all the invisible wounds that adults inflicted on children without meaning to. He'd been good at it, more than good. He'd had a gift for seeing past the behavior to the hurt underneath, for finding the exact right words or actions to bridge into a child's locked-away world. And then Elena had gotten sick, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late, moving too fast. He'd thrown everything he had into saving her, into researching treatments, into believing that love and determination could beat biology. He'd neglected his practice, canceled appointments, let his clients drift away to other therapists. And in the end, none of it had mattered. She died anyway, leaving him with a 5-year-old daughter in a grief so profound it felt like drowning. He couldn't go back to that work afterward. Every child he saw was a reminder of his own child, now growing up without a mother. Every trauma he treated was a reminder that he couldn't fix the one that mattered most. So he'd let his license lapse, packed up their life, moved to this city where no one knew him, and found the most anonymous job he could: cleaning, emptying trash, mopping floors, work that required no emotional investment, no piece of his soul, no risk of failing anyone who mattered. Except tonight, he'd broken his own rule. He'd seen Emma Westbrook and he'd intervened. And now, Victoria Westbrook wanted a conversation, which meant she wanted something, and Marcus had nothing left to give. When his alarm went off at 6 a.m., he'd barely slept 3 hours. He made breakfast for Lily, walked her to the bus stop, kissed her forehead, and watched her climb onto the yellow school bus with her backpack that was almost as big as she was. Then he walked the 4 blocks to the convenience store where he bought his morning coffee, sat on a bench in the small park across from Westbrook Industries' gleaming glass tower, and stared at the building. He could just not go. Victoria Westbrook was a busy woman. She'd probably already forgotten about the night janitor who'd helped her daughter, or if she remembered, she'd understand that he hadn't shown up and she'd move on. That's what Marcus told himself as he sat on that bench, his coffee growing cold in his hand, watching the clock on his phone tick toward 9 a.m., but then he thought about Emma's face, about the way she'd held that stone like it contained all the answers she'd been looking for, about the questions she'd asked. Is Mommy like the river? And he thought about Lily, about what he would want someone to do if she was drowning and he couldn't reach her. At 8:57 a.m., Marcus stood up, threw his cold coffee in the trash, and walked into the pristine lobby of Westbrook Industries. The security guard at the desk looked at him with barely concealed suspicion until he checked the computer and found Marcus's name on the visitor list. He handed over a temporary badge with clear reluctance, as if worried Marcus might steal the silverware, and directed him to the executive elevators. The ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to another planet. Everything was steel and glass and expensive silence. When the doors opened, a young woman in a crisp suit was waiting. "Miss Gruke, Miss Westbrook is expecting you. Please follow me." She led him through a maze of corridors, past offices where people in expensive clothes made important phone calls and typed on computers that probably cost more than his monthly rent. Victoria's office was at the corner of the building, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the entire city. Victoria herself stood by those windows, her back to the door, and for a moment Marcus thought she might not have heard him enter, but then she turned, and he saw that she looked different than she had last night. The desperation was gone, replaced by something more composed, more controlled, but her eyes were red-rimmed, and he suspected she'd slept about as well as he had. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to a chair. "I wasn't sure you would." Marcus remained standing, his hands in his pockets, his defenses up. "What is this about, Miss Westbrook?" She studied him for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling of being assessed, measured, calculated. "What do you know about selective mutism, Mr. Chun?" The question caught him off guard. "Childhood anxiety disorder," he said slowly, his psychologist's brain engaging before he could stop it. "Children who have it are physically capable of speech but cannot speak in certain situations or to certain people, usually due to severe anxiety or trauma. It's not the same as being shy. It's more like being trapped." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Emma has been diagnosed with it. Or rather, the therapist thinks she has it. She spoke just fine until 6 months ago when her father left us. Since then, she won't speak at school, won't speak to therapists, barely speaks to me. Last night was the worst episode she's had in weeks." She paused. "And then you walked up and within 10 minutes had her calm, communicating and holding onto that stone like it was saving her life." Marcus felt the trap closing around him. "This is what I do, Miss Westbrook. I'm sorry about your daughter's struggles, but I'm not a therapist. I'm a janitor. You should speak with her doctors." Victoria moved away from the window and sat down behind her massive desk. She pulled something from a drawer and slid it across the polished surface toward him. It was a printout, a series of screenshots from security footage. They showed him kneeling by Emma, talking to her, placing the stone between them. The images were clear, detailed, showing every moment of their interaction. "I watched this footage 5 times this morning," Victoria said quietly. "I watched how you moved, how you spoke, how you knew exactly what to do. That wasn't luck, Mr. Chun. That was training and experience. So I'm going to ask you again, and this time I'd appreciate the truth. Who are you, really?" Marcus stared at the security footage printout spread across Victoria's desk like evidence at a trial. His trial. The trap he'd feared had sprung shut, and there was no easy way out now. He could lie, maintain his cover, insist he was just a janitor who'd gotten lucky, but Victoria Westbrook hadn't built an empire by being easy to fool, and the intensity in her gaze told him she already knew the answer. She was just waiting for him to confirm it. He sat down heavily in the chair he'd been refusing, suddenly exhausted by the weight of 3 years of hiding. "I was a child psychologist," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I had a small practice in Boston. I specialized in trauma and anxiety disorders in children aged 5 to 12. I was good at it." His voice was flat, reciting facts as if they belonged to someone else. "Then my wife got sick and everything fell apart. I couldn't save her, couldn't help my own daughter through losing her mother, couldn't face other people's broken children when I couldn't fix my own broken life, so I left. I came here. I became invisible." Victoria leaned back in her chair, processing this information with the same analytical focus she probably used in board meeting. "How long did you practice?" 8 years, Marcus answered. "I had my doctorate in child psychology from Boston University. I published papers on nonverbal communication techniques for children with selective mutism." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd literally written about the exact condition Emma was suffering from. And here he was, pretending none of that expertise existed. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her face. Then she spoke, and her voice had lost all its corporate polish. It was just the voice of a desperate mother. "My daughter hasn't had a full conversation with me in 6 months, Mr. Chun. She writes me notes sometimes, she nods or shakes her head, but I haven't heard her laugh, haven't heard her say she loves me, haven't heard her voice except in screams when she has meltdowns like last night. I've spent over $200,000 on specialists. I've taken her to the top pediatric psychiatrists in the country. None of them have been able to reach her the way you did in 10 minutes. Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "That was just a moment, Miss Westbrook. One interaction doesn't mean I can help her long term. I'm not that person anymore. I can't be that person anymore." "Why not?" The question was simple, direct, and completely devastating. "Because I failed," Marcus said, the words erupting from somewhere deep inside him. "Because when it really mattered, When my own family needed me, all my training and expertise meant nothing. My wife died and my daughter cried herself to sleep every night for a year, and nothing I did could fix it. What right do I have to help other people's children when I couldn't protect my own child from that pain? Victoria stood up and walked around her desk, leaning against it so she was closer to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. Miss Chun, Marcus, your wife died of cancer. That wasn't a failure of your psychological training. That was biology. It was tragedy. It wasn't something you could fix with therapy techniques or communication strategies. But my daughter, she's not dying, she's lost. And you know the map to where she is because you've been there yourself. Marcus looked up at her, and for the first time since Elena's death, he felt seen, truly seen. Not as the invisible janitor, not as the broken widower, but as the man he used to be. The one who understood pain and knew how to build bridges across it. I don't know if I can do this, he said honestly. I don't know if I have anything left to give. Victoria crouched down so they were at eye level, and in that moment, the power dynamic between CEO and janitor completely dissolved. They were just two parents trying to save their children from drowning. I'm not asking you to fix everything. I'm not asking you to be who you used to be. I'm asking you to try. For Emma, just try. She paused. I'll pay you, of course. Whatever rate you think is fair. Consulting fees, therapy sessions, whatever you want to call it. The mention of money sent a jolt through Marcus. The mercenary part of his brain, the part that worried constantly about Lily's future, about college funds and medical emergencies and all the what-ifs that haunted single parents, immediately started calculating. What Victoria was offering could change their lives. But accepting it would mean stepping back into the world he'd fled, would mean opening himself up to the possibility of failure, would mean caring about a child who wasn't his own and risking the grief that came when he couldn't save her. I need time to think about this, he said finally. Victoria nodded and stood up, extending her hand. Take the time you need. But Marcus, whatever you decide, thank you for last night. Thank you for seeing my daughter when everyone else, including me, was just seeing a problem to be solved. Her handshake was firm, professional, but her eyes held a plea that transcended any business transaction. Marcus left the building in a daze, walking through the gleaming lobby without seeing it, stepping out onto the busy street without registering the noise and chaos. He walked for blocks without direction, his mind a hurricane of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The smart thing would be to refuse, to protect himself and Lily from the complications that would inevitably follow. Victoria Westbrook's world and his world were separated by more than just money. They were separated by expectations, by social strata, by the fundamental difference between people who fixed problems and people who cleaned up after them. But he kept seeing Emma's face, kept hearing the question that had broken his heart. Is mommy like the river? Kept feeling the weight of that smooth stone in his palm, the one Lily had given him, because even at 6 years old, she'd understood that grief needed somewhere to go. He found himself at the park, the same one where he'd sat that morning, and he pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in 3 years. Dr. Sarah Winters, his former colleague and friend from his Boston practice. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and surprised. Marcus Chun. I'd almost given up hope of ever hearing from you again. How are you? I'm standing in a park trying to decide if I'm going to destroy my life, he said with dark humor. Sarah laughed, that familiar sound that had gotten him through his worst days after Elena's death. Well, that sounds dramatic. Tell me everything, he told her. About the job, about Emma, about Victoria's offer, about his fear. Sarah listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. You want to know what I think? She asked finally. I think you've been punishing yourself for 3 years for a crime you didn't commit. Elena's death wasn't your fault. Your inability to prevent it wasn't a professional failure. It was a human limitation. And hiding from your gift, from who you are, isn't protecting Lily. It's teaching her that when things get hard, you run and hide. The words hit like a physical blow because they were true. What if I fail this little girl? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if I can't help her? Then you'll have tried, Sarah said simply. Which is more than she has right now. Marcus, selective mutism is exactly what you specialized in. You published the definitive paper on trust-building techniques with nonverbal children. This is literally what you were trained to do. And from what you've told me, you've already made more progress in one interaction than all her other therapists combined. But I'm not licensed anymore, Marcus protested. I'd be working as a consultant, not a therapist. That's fine, Sarah said. You'd be surprised how many practitioners do consulting work. As long as you're not billing insurance companies or claiming to provide clinical therapy, you can absolutely work with a family as a behavioral consultant or coach. Victoria Westbrook is hiring you privately. That's completely legitimate. She paused. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You try for a few weeks, and if it's not working, you stop. But if you don't try, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you had. After the call ended, Marcus sat on that park bench for another hour, watching parents with their children, watching the world move around him while he remained frozen in indecision. But the decision, he realized, had already been made the moment he'd knelt beside Emma last night, the moment he'd reached into his pocket and pulled out Lily's worry stone, the moment he'd chosen to see a child instead of walking away. He pulled up Victoria's number from the card she'd given him and typed out a text before he could second-guess himself. I'll do it. Trial basis. 4 weeks. If I don't see progress or if I feel I'm not the right fit, I walk away, no questions asked. And I need complete confidentiality. No one else in the company can know about this. The response came back within 60 seconds. Agreed. All conditions accept. Can you start this evening? Emma has been asking about the man with the stone. Marcus smiled despite himself. It seemed Emma Westbrook was just as persistent as her mother. He typed back, 7 p.m., your home address. And Miss Westbrook, I'll need you to understand something. This isn't about fixing your daughter. She's not broken. This is about helping her find her voice again. There's a difference. Victoria's response was simple but profound. I'm beginning to understand that. Thank you, Marcus. He stood up from the bench, his decision made, his course set. As he walked toward the bus stop that would take him home to prepare for his evening with Lily, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. It wasn't quite hope. It was more like possibility. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could be someone other than the invisible janitor. That maybe helping Emma Westbrook would somehow help him find his own voice again. The one he'd lost in the hospital room where Elena had taken her last breath. He didn't know yet that this decision would change everything, that Victoria Westbrook would become more than a client, that Emma would become more than a patient, that the walls he'd built between his old life and his new one were about to come crashing down in ways he couldn't predict or control. All he knew was that tonight he would sit with a hurting child and try to build a bridge, and maybe, if he was very lucky, he'd find that he still remembered how. Victoria Westbrook's home was not what Marcus had expected, though in retrospect, he wasn't sure what he'd been expecting. The address she'd given him led to a converted warehouse in the Arts District, the kind of place that screamed deliberate understatement while probably costing more than most suburban mansions. The exterior was all exposed brick and industrial windows, but when Victoria answered the door herself, no butler or housekeeper in sight. The interior revealed something far more human than he'd anticipated. The space was open and flowing, with high ceilings and warm lighting that softened the industrial edges. But what struck Marcus most was the evidence of Emma everywhere. Children's drawings covered one entire brick wall, held up with colorful magnets. A reading nook had been created in one corner with pillows and stuffed animals. A small table held an abandoned art project, paint still wet on paper. This wasn't a showroom. This was a home where a child actually lived. Thank you for coming, Victoria said, and Marcus noticed she'd changed from her CEO armor into jeans and a simple sweater. Her hair was down, and without the severe professional styling, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Emma's in her room. She's been asking about you all day, about the stones specifically. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. I brought more, he said. Different colors, different textures. Sometimes children connect with different stones for different feeling. Victoria looked at the bag like it contained magic, which in a way, Marcus supposed it did. The magic of small, simple things that gave children permission to feel without words. Before we go in, he said, I need to set some expectations. Progress with selective mutism isn't linear. Some days will feel like breakthroughs. Other days will feel like we're back at square one. The goal isn't to force Emma to speak. The goal is to create enough safety that she chooses to speak when she's ready. Victoria nodded, but Marcus could see the impatience lurking beneath her understanding. She was a woman used to setting goals and crushing them, to identifying problems and implementing solutions. The uncertain timeline of childhood trauma recovery was going to test every leadership skill she had. How long do you think it will take? She asked, and Marcus heard the desperate hope underneath the clinical question. I don't know, he answered honestly. I've worked with children who found their voices in weeks and others who took years. Every child is different. Every trauma is. What I can tell you is that she's already shown me she wants to communicate. That stone last night wasn't just about calming down. It was about having something that held her feelings when she couldn't speak them. That's a huge first step. They walked down a hallway lined with more of Emma's artwork, and Marcus found himself studying the drawing. They told a story if you knew how to read them. Early drawings dated from before her father left showed bright colors, full families, smiling faces. The more recent ones grew progressively darker, more isolated, single figures, often with no mouths drawn on them. One particularly striking image showed a small person surrounded by enormous, looming shadows. Emma was screaming silently through her art, and everyone had been too focused on the absence of her voice to hear her. Victoria knocked softly on a door decorated with Emma's name in hand-painted letters. Sweetheart, Marcus is here. The man from last night with the stone. There was a pause, then the sound of small footsteps. The door opened slowly, and Emma peered out, her dark eyes cautious but curious. She was holding the gray-blue stone he'd given her last night, and when she saw Marcus, the tiniest smile flickered across her face. Marcus knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. Hi, Emma, he said softly. I brought some friends for your stone. Want to see? Emma's eyes widened and she nodded, stepping back to let him into her room. It was a child's paradise, full of books and toys and art supplies, but Marcus noticed immediately that despite all the abundance, everything was meticulously organized, too organized for a 7-year-old. It was the room of a child trying desperately to control the one thing she could control when everything else felt chaotic. He sat on the floor, and Emma sat across from him, maintaining a careful distance but clearly interested. He pulled out the cloth bag and spread out 6 stones on the carpet between them, creating a small rainbow of geological variety. Smooth black stone, a rough piece of rose quartz, flat white stone with a gray stripe, a small piece of green aventurine, a chunky piece of tiger's eye, and a perfect sphere of clear quartz that caught the light and fractured it into tiny rainbows. Each of these stones is special. Marcus said, not looking at Emma directly but keeping his attention on the stones. "This black one is obsidian, volcanic glass born in fire. Some people use it when they're feeling angry because it can hold really hot feelings." He moved to the rose quartz. "This one is for sad feelings, for missing someone, for when your heart hurts. The tiger's eye is for when you're scared but trying to be brave. The aventurine is for when you feel lost and need help finding your way. The clear quartz is for when you have lots of different feelings all mixed up together and you need help sorting them out." Emma's hand reached out slowly, hovering over the stones. Her fingers finally settled on the rose quartz, lifting it carefully and holding it up to the light. Marcus noticed Victoria standing in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, watching her daughter engage in a way she apparently hadn't seen in months. Emma turned the stone over in her small hands, feeling its rough, unpolished surface, so different from the smooth river stone. "That's a good choice," Marcus said quietly. "That stone has been waiting for someone who understands the kind of feelings it holds." Emma looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes he saw a question forming. He waited, giving her space, no pressure. After a long moment, she set down the rose quartz and picked up the black obsidian stone. Then she picked up the tiger's eye. She held one in each hand, looking between them with an expression of intense concentration. "It's okay to need more than one," Marcus said. "Sometimes we feel lots of things at the same time. Sometimes we're sad and angry and scared all at once." Emma nodded slowly, then did something that made Marcus's heart clench. She picked up all 6 stones, cradling them against her chest like they were precious treasures. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw a simple truth. She needed all of them. Every feeling, every color, every texture. She was carrying all of it. Marcus reached into his bag again and pulled out a small drawstring pouch made of soft purple velvet. "Would you like something to keep them in? A special place just for your feeling stones?" Emma's eyes lit up and she nodded eagerly. He handed her the pouch and she carefully, reverently placed each stone inside, arranging them just so before pulling the drawstring closed. She held the pouch to her chest, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, her shoulders relaxed slightly. Victoria moved into the room then, sitting on Emma's bed, her movements careful and measured. Marcus could see she wanted to rush in, wanted to hug her daughter, wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but she held back, trusting his lead. "That's beautiful, Emma," Victoria said softly. "Your special stones." Emma looked at her mother, then at Marcus, then back at her mother. She opened the pouch and pulled out the rose quartz. With slow, deliberate movements, she walked over to Victoria and placed the stone in her mother's hand. The gesture was so simple and so profound that Victoria's eyes immediately filled with tears. "For me?" she whispered. Emma nodded, then pointed at the stone, then at her own heart, then at Victoria. The message was crystal clear. "This stone is for the hurt in my heart that's also in your heart. This stone is for missing, for loss, for the family that broke apart. This stone says I know you're sad too." Victoria pulled Emma into her arms and the little girl let herself be held, the pouch of stones clutched between them. Marcus stood quietly, giving them their moment, and felt something shift in his own chest. The rusty gears of his therapeutic instincts were starting to turn again, and he realized that he hadn't forgotten how to do this. The skills had been there all along, just buried under grief and fear. After Victoria and Emma separated, Marcus pulled out a small notebook and a set of colored pencils. He opened to a blank page and drew a simple face, just a circle with 2 dots for eyes. Then he handed the notebook and pencils to Emma. "Sometimes when words are hard, pictures are easy. Would you like to draw me a picture of how you're feeling right now?" Emma took the notebook with both hands, studying the simple face he'd drawn. Then she picked up a blue pencil and added a small curved line for a mouth. Not a smile, but not a frown either. Something neutral, something in between. She added tears falling from the eyes, but then she drew something else. Small hearts floating up from the head like thoughts or dream. It was the picture of someone who was sad but also hopeful. Someone who was hurting but also healing. "That's perfect," Marcus said. "That tells me so much." He looked at Victoria. "I think that's enough for today. We don't want to push too hard too fast. Emma needs to know these sessions are safe, that there's no pressure, no expectations, just space to feel and communicate in whatever way feels right to her." Victoria nodded, and Marcus could see her fighting every instinct she had to demand more, to push for faster results, to implement an aggressive strategy for recovery. As Marcus gathered his things, Emma tugged on his sleeve. He looked down and she was holding the original gray-blue stone, the worry stone Lily had given it. She held it out to him, a clear question in her eyes. "Can I keep this one too?" "That's your stone," Marcus said, closing her fingers gently around it. "But I need to tell you something. That stone was given to me by my daughter when I was very sad. Her mommy, my wife, had died, and I didn't know how to hold all my sad feelings. My daughter, her name is Lily. She gave me that stone and told me it would listen to my worries so I didn't have to carry them alone." Emma's eyes went wide, understanding blooming across her face. The stone wasn't just a stone. It was a story. It was proof that other people, even adults, had big feelings they didn't know how to hold. She looked at the stone in her hand with new reverence, then looked up at Marcus and did something extraordinary. She placed the stone over her heart, then touched Marcus's chest, right over his heart. Then she touched her own throat. the place where words should come from but didn't. Marcus understood immediately. She was saying, "Your heart hurts so much it was hard to speak to. I'm not alone in this. I'm not broken or wrong or strained. Even grown-ups sometimes lose their words when the feelings are too big." "Yes," he said softly. "Yes, Emma. Sometimes grown-ups lose their words too, and that's okay. We find other ways to talk until the words are ready to come back." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer, and carefully placed the worry stone in her velvet pouch with the others. As Marcus left the Westbrook home that evening, walking out into the cool night air, he felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years. He felt useful. He felt like maybe the universe hadn't made a mistake when it gave him this particular set of skills. Maybe there was a reason he understood silent suffering. Maybe his own pain had trained him to see it in others. He pulled out his phone and texted Victoria. "Good for a session. Same time in 3 days?" The response came quickly. "Yes." And Marcus, "Thank you doesn't cover it, but thank you." He smiled and typed back, "She's a remarkable kid. You're doing better than you think." As he rode the bus home to his own remarkable kid, he thought about the stones, about the way simple objects could become vessels for impossible feeling. And he thought about Lily's wisdom, how even at 6 years old she'd known that grief needed somewhere to go, something to hold it. Maybe that's all therapy really was, he thought, giving people permission to feel and a place to put those feelings until they were ready to examine them. Maybe magic stones weren't magic at all. Maybe they were just permission. Permission to be hurt, to be scared, to be lost, and most importantly, permission to hope that someday those feelings might change. The sessions fell into a rhythm over the next 3 weeks, a gentle pattern that felt nothing like the rigid therapeutic structures Marcus had once practiced. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evening at 7 p.m., he would arrive at Victoria's home, and Emma would be waiting, her velvet pouch of stones ready. They never spoke about speaking. They never addressed the silence directly. Instead, they built a language of their own. On the second week, Marcus introduced drawing games. He would start a picture, just a simple line or shape, and slide the paper to Emma. She would add to it, creating something entirely unexpected, and slide it back. Together, they created entire worlds without words. Dragons that were actually friendly. Princesses who saved themselves. Families that looked nothing like traditional families, but were families nonetheless. Victoria would watch from the kitchen, pretending to work on her laptop, but Marcus knew she was really watching her daughter come alive in ways she hadn't seen in months. The breakthrough came on a Friday evening during the third week. Marcus had brought a small kaleidoscope, the kind that made beautiful patterns when you looked through it and turned the cylinder. Emma had been fascinated, holding it up to the light, turning it slowly, watching the colored glass fragments create and destroy perfect symmetries. Then she'd lowered it and looked at Marcus with those serious, thoughtful eyes. She pointed to the kaleidoscope, then to herself, then made a breaking motion with her hands. Marcus understood immediately. "Before I was like this. All the pieces making a pretty picture. Then everything broke, and now the pieces are just scattered and nothing makes sense anymore." It was perhaps the most articulate description of trauma he'd ever encountered, and it had been communicated entirely without words. He nodded slowly, validating her metaphor. Then he took the kaleidoscope gently from her hands, deliberately broke the pattern by turning it randomly, and handed it back. "Look again," he said softly. Emma lifted it to her eye and gasped. The new pattern was different from the old one, but it was still beautiful. Different pieces, different arrangement, but still whole, still making something worth looking at. Marcus waited, letting her process this revelation on her own timeline. Finally, she lowered the kaleidoscope and looked at him. And in her eyes, he saw the question. "Can I really be beautiful again even though I'm different now? Even though everything changed?" "You already are," Marcus said. "You were never broken, Emma. You just got shaken up. All your pieces are still there. They're just making a different pattern now, and different doesn't mean wrong. It just means different." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. It was the first real smile Victoria had seen from her daughter in 6 months. And from the kitchen, Marcus heard a small, choked sound as Victoria tried to hold back her own tears. That night, as Marcus was leaving, Victoria walked him to the door, a habit that had developed over the weeks. These few minutes of conversation had become something they'd both looked forward to, a chance to decompress, to share observation, to connect as two adults navigating impossible situations. "She's making progress," Victoria said, hope and fear fighting for dominance in her voice. "I can see it. But Marcus, when do you think she'll actually speak? When will I hear her voice again?" Marcus chose his words carefully. "The progress you're seeing is the speaking, Victoria. She's communicating more now than she probably has in months. The verbal speech will come when she feels safe enough to risk it. Pushing for it will only make her retreat further." Victoria's frustration was visible, but she nodded. "I know. I just miss her voice so much. Sometimes I listen to old videos just to remember what she sounds like." The confession was raw, vulnerable, and Marcus felt something shift between them, something that went beyond professional consultant and client. Over those 3 weeks, Marcus's life began to change in other ways too. The arrangement with Victoria paid more than he'd expected, enough that he gave notice at his janitorial job, much to the confusion of his supervisor. He told Lily he'd found a new job helping a little girl who was having trouble talking, and Lily, with her characteristic wisdom, had asked if she could meet Emma sometime. "Kids understand other kids better than grown-ups do," she'd said matter-of-factly, and Marcus couldn't argue with that logic. So on a Saturday afternoon in the 4th week, Marcus brought Lily to Victoria's home. The two women, Victoria and Lily, studied each other with mutual curiosity. Victoria saw a bright-eyed 8-year-old with her father's thoughtful expression and a confidence that seemed at odds with her secondhand clothes and worn sneakers. Lily saw a woman who looked scary at first with her perfect hair and expensive clothes, but whose eyes were sad in the same way her daddy's eyes were sometimes sad. Emma and Lily, however, needed no such assessment period. They looked at each other and seemed to recognize kindred spirits instantly. Within 5 minutes, they were in Emma's room, door closed, engaged in whatever mysterious activities children engage in when adults aren't watching. Marcus and Victoria found themselves alone in the living room, an awkward silence settling between them that was different from their usual comfortable post-session conversation. "Your daughter is lovely," Victoria said finally. "She has your eyes." Marcus smiled. "She has her mother's spirit, though." Elena was fearless. She walked into every room like she owned it, like she belonged everywhere. Lily got that from her. "I just gave her the anxiety and the tendency to overthink everything." Victoria laughed, a real, genuine sound that Marcus realized he hadn't heard before. "My ex-husband was fearless too. Reckless, actually. He made decisions based on feelings, on whims. I gave Emma the anxiety, the need to control everything, because if you don't control it, it controls you." "Is that what drew you to him?" Marcus asked. "The opposite qualities?" Victoria considered this, settling into the couch with a glass of wine she'd poured for herself, offering one to Marcus, which he'd declined. "I think I was drawn to his freedom. He was an artist. He saw the world in colors and possibilities. I saw it in spreadsheets and risk assessments. Together we were supposed to balance each other out." She took a sip of wine. "But it turns out opposite qualities that attract you in dating become the things you fight about in marriage. He thought I was too rigid, too focused on work. I thought he was too impractical, too unreliable, and Emma was caught in the middle." "Why did he leave?" Marcus asked, then immediately regretted the intrusion. "I'm sorry, that's too personal." "No," Victoria said, surprising him. "It's fine. He left because I asked him to choose. Me and Emma, or his art studio and his freedom. I gave him an ultimatum because that's what I do. I solve problems by making decisions." She set down her wine glass, her hands trembling slightly. "He chose the art. He chose himself." And Emma watched him pack his bags and walk out, and she hasn't been the same since. The pain in Victoria's voice was palpable, and Marcus found himself moving closer, not quite sitting next to her, but near enough that she didn't feel alone in her confession. "That wasn't your fault," he said quietly. "You didn't make him choose his art over his daughter. He made that choice. And giving someone an ultimatum when you need them to be present for their child isn't wrong. It's called having standards." Victoria looked at him, her eyes shining. "Do you really believe that?" "Because Emma's therapist seemed to think I pushed him away, that my controlling nature and my inability to compromise drove him out." Marcus felt anger flare in his chest, anger at therapists who would blame a mother for a father's abandonment. "That's garbage," he said, more forcefully than he intended. "Emma went silent because the person she trusted to always be there walked away. That's trauma from abandonment, not trauma from you having expectations of her father. Those therapists were wrong." Victoria's expression shifted, surprise and relief, and something else, something that looked almost like gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much I needed to hear that." The sound of giggles erupted from Emma's room, both girls laughing at something, and Marcus and Victoria both turned toward the sound instinctively. "When was the last time you heard her laugh?" Marcus asked softly. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. 6 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, she said. "I've been counting," as if saying the number out loud would somehow make the silence less permanent. The laughter continued, pure and joyful, and so achingly normal that it broke something open in both of them. When Lily and Marcus left that evening, Emma walked them to the door, something she'd never done before. She was holding Lily's hand, and when they reached the threshold, Emma did something extraordinary. She pulled a stone from her velvet pouch, the white one with the gray stripe, and held it out to Lily. Lily looked at her father, a question in her eyes, and Marcus nodded. "Emma wants to give you a gift." Lily took the stone carefully, reverently. "Thank you, Emma," she said. "I'll keep it safe, I promise." Emma smiled, then did something even more extraordinary. She leaned forward and hugged Lily, a quick, tight embrace that was over in seconds but felt monumentous. When she pulled back, she looked at Marcus and mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." No sound came out, but the intention was clear. She was trying. The words were forming. They just hadn't found their voice yet. In the car on the way home, Lily held the stone carefully, studying it in the streetlight that filtered through the windows. "Daddy," she said thoughtfully, "I think Emma's going to be okay. She's just scared that if she talks, something bad will happen. Like her daddy will leave again or her mommy will disappear. So she's protecting herself by staying quiet." Marcus glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, constantly amazed by her insight. "How did you get so wise, kiddo?" She shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe because you talk to me like I'm a real person instead of just a kid. Maybe because when mommy died, you let me be sad instead of telling me to be brave. I learned that feelings are okay." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. He'd spent 3 years worrying that he was failing Lily, that his grief was damaging her, that his inability to move on was teaching her all the wrong lessons. But maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. Maybe his willingness to feel his pain instead of hiding it had taught her that pain was survivable, that it was human, that it was okay. That night, after tucking Lily into bed, Marcus sat in his small living room and thought about the strange turn his life had taken. 4 weeks ago, he'd been an invisible janitor, content to hide from the world in his past. Now he was sitting in the home of a CEO, drinking coffee, discussing childhood trauma and failed marriages. He was watching two little girls become friends. He was remembering what it felt like to be good at something, to have purpose beyond just surviving. And he was starting to feel something for Victoria Westbrook that went beyond professional respect. Something that terrified him because it felt like hope. And hope was dangerous. Hope meant opening yourself up to loss again. Hope meant caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy you. He'd built his entire life around avoiding that vulnerability, and now here it was, creeping in through the cracks despite his best defenses. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Emma just asked me using hand signals if Lily can come over again next week. I think your daughter might be working magic that neither of us expected." Marcus smiled and typed back, "Lily would love that. Kids speak a language adults forget. Maybe that's Emma's way back, through friendship instead of therapy." Victoria's response came quickly. "Maybe it's all of our ways back. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. For seeing Emma, for seeing me, for reminding me that broken things can make beautiful patterns." Marcus stared at that last message for a long time, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. He knew he should keep this professional, should maintain boundaries, should protect himself and Lily from getting too attached to people who lived in a completely different world. But as he looked around his small apartment, at the life he'd built from grief and determination, he wondered if maybe it was time to stop protecting himself quite so fiercely. Maybe it was time to risk caring again. The complications started, as they often do, with something small and seemingly insignificant. Marcus was at the grocery store with Lily on a Tuesday afternoon when he ran into someone he hadn't seen in 3 years. Jennifer Park, a former colleague from his Boston practice, was standing in the produce section comparing apples with the intensity of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Marcus?" Her voice was startled, disbelieving. "Marcus Chun? Oh my God, I thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth." "We all did. After Elena died and you just disappeared, we didn't know if you'd moved or if something had happened to you too." Marcus felt Lily's hand tighten in his, her instinctive response to tension. "Hi, Jennifer. Yeah, we relocated. Fresh start and all that." He tried to keep his voice neutral, casual, but Jennifer was already looking at him with that particular mixture of pity and judgment that he'd fled Boston to escape. "I heard you let your license lapse," she said, and there was an edge to her voice. "Such a waste, Marcus. You were one of the best. We could have helped you through the grief. You didn't have to throw your whole career away." The words stung precisely because there was truth in them. He'd thrown it away. He had run instead of facing the pain. But he'd also survived, which counted for something. "I didn't throw it away," he said quietly. "I put it down when I needed to." "There's a difference." Jennifer's expression softened slightly. "Are you working again? Therapeutically, I mean?" Marcus hesitated, aware of Lily listening to every word. "I'm doing some consulting work, helping a family with a child who has selective mutism." Jennifer's eyebrows shot up. "Selective mutism. That was your specialty, so you are getting back into it." "That's good, Marcus. Really good, but you need to be careful. If you're providing therapeutic services without a license, you could face serious legal consequence. You know that, right?" The warning landed like a stone in Marcus's stomach. He'd been so focused on helping Emma, on rebuilding his sense of purpose, that he hadn't fully considered the legal implications of what he was doing. "I'm just consulting," he repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not billing insurance or claiming to provide clinical therapy. It's a private arrangement." Jennifer nodded, but her expression remained concerned. "Just be careful. That's all I'm saying. The state board doesn't mess around with unlicensed practice. Make sure whatever you're doing is clearly documented as consultation, not therapy." After Jennifer left, Lily tugged on his hand. "Daddy, are you in trouble?" Her voice was small, worried, and Marcus hated that she'd overheard enough to be scared. "No, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to her level right there in the produce aisle. "I'm not in trouble. Miss Jennifer was just reminding me to be careful about how I do my work, that's all." But Lily's worried expression didn't fully clear, and Marcus realized that his past was catching up with him in ways he hadn't anticipated. That evening, instead of his usual session with Emma, Marcus asked Victoria if they could talk first. They sat in her home office while Emma played in her room, and Marcus explained the encounter with Jennifer, the concerns about licensing, the need to ensure they were operating within legal boundaries. Victoria listened with the focused attention of someone used to assessing risk, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I'll have my legal team draw up a clear consulting agreement," she said finally. "One that explicitly states you're providing behavioral coaching and support, not clinical therapy. We'll document everything properly, keep detailed records of sessions, make sure there's no ambiguity about the nature of the work." She looked at him directly. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to let some technicality take you away from Emma, not when you're the first person who's actually helped her in 6 months." The fierceness in her voice surprised him, and something in his chest tightened. "I appreciate that, but Victoria, if there's any risk of legal problems, we should probably bring in a licensed therapist to take over. I can't put you or Emma in a position where my involvement causes problem." Victoria shook her head firmly. "No. Do you know how many licensed therapists Emma has seen? 7. 7 different specialists, all with impressive credentials, all with proven technique. None of them connected with her. None of them saw her the way you. I'm not losing that because of paperwork." Marcus felt the weight of her faith in him, and it was both humbling and terrifying. "Okay," he said slowly. "Let's do it right. Proper documentation, clear boundaries, everything above board. But Victoria, you need to understand that consulting has limitations. I can't diagnose her formally. I can't write prescriptions if she needs medication. I can't provide the kind of comprehensive treatment plan a licensed therapist could offer. I understand, Victoria said. But right now, Emma doesn't need a diagnosis or a treatment plan. She needs someone who makes her feel safe enough to try. That's you. The legal agreement was drafted within 48 hours, a testament to Victoria's resources and determination. It clearly outlined Marcus's role as a behavioral consultant and family coach, emphasized that he was not providing clinical psychological services, and included detailed protocols for documentation and session notes. Marcus signed it feeling both relieved and slightly nauseated. The paperwork made it official, which meant he could no longer pretend he was just casually helping out. This was real. This mattered. And if he failed, it would be documented failure. But Emma, blissfully unaware of the legal machinations happening around her, continued to make progress. In their next session, she did something remarkable. She brought out a notebook, the kind with blank pages for drawing, and showed Marcus that she'd been creating a dictionary. Not a verbal dictionary, but a visual one. Each page showed an emotion or concept drawn in her careful, childish hand. Happy was a sun, sad was rain. Angry was a storm cloud with light. Scared was a dark scribbled shadow. Love was two stick figures holding hands with hearts floating above them. This is incredible, Marcus said, genuinely awed. You've created your own language. Emma beamed with pride, then flipped to a page she'd obviously been working on recently. It showed a figure that looked like Marcus, identifiable by the stones he always carried, standing between two other figures, one smaller and one larger, who were holding hands. The larger figure wore a business suit. The smaller one held a velvet pout, and above all three of them were the words, written in careful, deliberate letters, "My people." Marcus felt his throat tighten. She was claiming them. Him, Victoria, herself. She was creating a new definition of family. One that included the broken pieces reconfigured into something new. He looked at Victoria, who was standing in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. She'd seen the picture too. She'd understood what it meant. Emma wasn't just healing, she was building, she was choosing. Over the next 2 weeks, the sessions evolved into something more organic, less structured. Sometimes Lily would join them, and the two girls would play while Marcus and Victoria talked, sharing stories about their respective disasters of marriages, their fears about parenting, their dreams for their daughters' futures. Sometimes Emma would pull Victoria into the sessions, insisting through gestures that her mother participate in the drawing games or the stone ceremonies they'd developed. And slowly, inevitably, Marcus and Victoria began to lean on each other in ways that went beyond the professional relationship they'd carefully constructed. Victoria started texting him about things unrelated to Emma, a funny thing a colleague said, a frustrating board meeting, a moment of joy she wanted to share. Marcus found himself looking forward to these messages, found himself crafting responses that were longer and more personal than necessary. One evening, after a particularly good session where Emma had nearly whispered a word before catching herself, Victoria walked Marcus to the door as usual. But instead of their typical brief goodbye, she hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. "Marcus," she said softly, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," he replied, though his heart rate immediately accelerated. "Do you ever think about dating again? About finding someone?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them had been willing to acknowledge until now. Marcus chose his words carefully. "I think about it sometimes. But dating as a single parent is complicated. You're not just choosing someone for yourself, you're choosing someone who will be in your child's life. That's a lot of pressure." He paused. "Why do you ask?" Victoria looked down at her hands, uncharacteristically uncertain. "Because I think about it too, and I keep thinking about it when I'm around you, which is probably inappropriate given our working relationship. And I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, but I needed to say it out loud." Marcus's breath caught. The confession was everything he'd been feeling but hadn't allowed himself to voice. "Victoria, it's not inappropriate. It's human. And for what it's worth, I think about it too. When I'm here, when I'm with you and Emma, I feel like maybe I could be part of something whole again. Not the same as before, but different. Like the kaleidoscope. A new pattern that's still beautiful." Victoria looked up at him then, and the vulnerability in her eyes was devastating. "What do we do about this? I don't want to mess up what we have. Emma needs you. I need you. But I also want more than professional boundaries and consulting agreements. I want to know if this thing between us is real or if I'm just projecting hope onto someone who makes my daughter smile." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something subtle and expansive that he'd come to associate with the end of sessions and these quiet moments at the door. "It's real," he said quietly. "I know it's complicated and scary and probably a terrible idea for a dozen professional reasons, but it's real. I haven't felt this way about anyone since Elena, and that terrifies me. But it's also the most alive I've felt in 3 years." Victoria's hand came up to rest lightly on his chest, and he could feel his heartbeat thundering under her palm. "So what do we do?" she asked again. Marcus covered her hand with his own. "We go slow," he said. "We protect the kids first. We make sure whatever happens between us doesn't compromise what Emma needs. But we also don't pretend it's not happening. We're honest about it, with each other and eventually with Emma and Lily." Victoria nodded, and then she did something that changed everything. She leaned up and kissed him. It was soft, tentative, a question more than a statement. Marcus froze for a half second of surprise before his body remembered how to respond. His hand coming up to cup her face, deepening the kiss slightly before pulling back. They stood there, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air. The magnitude of what they'd just acknowledged settling over them like snow. "This is going to be complicated," Victoria whispered. "Everything worth having is," Marcus replied. And then they heard it. A small gasp from the hallway. They turned to find Emma standing there, her velvet pouch clutched in her hands, her eyes wide. She looked from Marcus to her mother and back again, processing what she'd just witnessed. Marcus braced for fear, for regression, for the progress they'd made to shatter. But instead, Emma smiled. It was a small, knowing smile, the smile of a child who understood more than adults gave her credit for. She pulled out her notebook and quickly drew a picture. Two stick figures standing close together with a heart between them. Then she held it up and nodded firmly as if giving her approval. Marcus and Victoria both laughed, relief and joy mixing together, and the three of them stood in that hallway. Strange new family taking its first uncertain steps toward becoming real. The next morning, Marcus woke up with equal parts elation and terror coursing through his veins. He'd kissed Victoria Westbrook. More accurately, Victoria Westbrook had kissed him, and he'd kissed her back, and Emma had given them her blessing through crayon drawings. The whole thing felt simultaneously like a dream and like standing on the edge of a cliff he wasn't sure he was ready to jump from. Lily noticed immediately that something had shifted. Over breakfast, she studied him with those two perceptive eyes and asked, "Daddy, why do you look scared and happy at the same time?" Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. "What makes you think I look scared?" She shrugged, stabbing her cereal with her spoon. "You're smiling, but your eyebrows are doing that worried thing. That's your scared, happy face. You had it the first time we went to Disney World after Mommy died. You were happy to be there, but scared it was wrong to be happy." The observation gutted him with its accuracy. Lily had inherited Elena's emotional intelligence along with her fearlessness, which meant Marcus could never hide anything from her for long. "You're too smart for your own good, kiddo," he said, reaching over to ruffle her hair. "But yeah, something happened yesterday, something good, I think, but also kind of scary. Can I tell you about it?" Lily nodded, her expression serious, and Marcus realized he was about to have one of those parenting moments where he had no idea was doing it right or completely screwing it up. "You know how I've been helping Emma and spending time with her and her mom? Well, her mom and I have become friends. Good friends. And I think maybe we'd like to be more than friends eventually. How would you feel about that?" Lily's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, thoughtfulness, and then something that looked like cautious happiness. "Do you love her? Like you loved Mommy?" The question was direct and devastating in its simplicity. Marcus took a breath. "I don't know yet. I care about her a lot, but loving someone like I loved your mom, that takes time, and it would be different anyway because she's not your mom. Nobody will ever be your mom. Your mom was special and unique and irreplaceable." Lily nodded slowly, processing this. "And if you did love her someday, would we move? Would Emma become my sister? Would everything change?" These were the questions that mattered to an 8-year-old. The practical implications that adults sometimes forgot were just as important as the emotional one. "I don't know," Marcus answered honestly. "We're taking things very slowly. Right now, we're just figuring out if this could work. And nothing, absolutely nothing would happen without you being okay with it. You're the most important person in my life, Lily. Always." Lily smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I like Emma, and her mom is nice even though she's kind of fancy. If you're happy, Daddy, then I'm happy. But you have to promise me something." Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Anything. Promise me you won't stop being sad about Mommy just because you're happy about someone new. Because I still get sad about her and I need to know it's okay." Marcus pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "Oh, sweetheart, I will never stop being sad about your mom. Not ever. She was the love of my life, and losing her broke something in me that will never fully heal. Being happy about Victoria doesn't erase that. It just means I'm learning that broken things can still work, can still love, and still build something beautiful. We can be sad about Mommy and happy about new things at the same time." Lily hugged him back fiercely, and they stayed like that for a long moment. Father and daughter holding each other through the complicated emotions that came with moving forward, while still holding on to the past. When they finally separated, Lily looked at him with those wise beyond her years eyes and said, "Okay, Daddy, you can love Emma's mom. I give you permission." Meanwhile, across town in the executive offices of Westbrook Industries, Victoria was having a similar conversation with her own daughter. Emma had come into her mother's home office that morning carrying her notebook and had very deliberately shown Victoria a series of drawings she'd made overnight. The first showed Marcus and Victoria holding hands with a heart above them. The second showed Lily and Emma playing. The third showed all four of them together, a makeshift family standing in front of a house. Victoria studied the drawings with a mixture of hope and fear. "Do you like Marcus's sweetheart?" Emma nodded enthusiastically, then flipped to another page. This one showed Marcus with his stones, but instead of being surrounded by darkness like Emma's earlier drawings, he was surrounded by light. The message was clear. Marcus made things brighter. He made the darkness less scary. "And how would you feel if Marcus and I spent more time together? If he became more than just your consultant?" Emma's response was immediate. She grabbed a purple crayon and drew a giant yes across the page, underlining it 3 times for emphasis. Then she did something she hadn't done in weeks. She tried to speak. Her mouth opened, her lips formed the shape of words, and the tiniest whisper of sound emerged. Not words exactly, but the beginning of them, the ghost of her voice testing if it was safe to return. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, baby, are you trying to tell me something?" Emma nodded, frustrated by her inability to push the words out. She grabbed her mother's hand and placed it over her own throat, then pointed to the drawing of the makeshift family. Victoria understood. Her voice was coming back because she felt safe, because the broken pieces were forming a new pattern that made sense, because love was returning to their home in unexpected forms. Later that day, Victoria had to attend an important board meeting, one she couldn't reschedule. She left Emma with her regular babysitter and went to face the corporate world she'd been increasingly disconnected from over the past 2 months. The meeting was tense. Several board members expressed concern about her recent distraction, about delayed decision, about her absence from key negotiation. One particularly aggressive member, a man named Richard Carver, confronted her directly. "Victoria, I'll be frank. Your performance lately has been concerning. You're not present. You're delegating decisions that should be yours. Some of us are wondering if perhaps you need to take a leave of absence to deal with whatever personal issues are affecting your focus." The implication was clear. They were considering removing her as CEO. Victoria felt anger flash through her, hot and righteous. She'd built this company from nothing. She'd made them all rich beyond their wildest dreams. And now they wanted to sideline her because she'd been focused on her daughter's well-being. But instead of exploding, which was her first instinct, she took a breath and thought about what Marcus would do. He'd see beneath the aggression to the fear driving it. These men were afraid that without her laser focus, the company would suffer. They weren't being malicious. They were being protective of their investments. So she did something she'd never done before in a board meeting. She told them the truth. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "you're right. I have been distracted. My 7-year-old daughter has selective mutism resulting from trauma. For 6 months, she hasn't spoken. I've been spending my evenings helping her heal instead of answering emails at midnight. And yes, that's affected my availability, but it hasn't affected my performance. Every metric we track shows we're exceeding projections. Every initiative I've launched is on schedule or ahead of it. What's changed is that I'm no longer sacrificing my daughter's well-being for an extra percentage point of profit." The room was silent. Richard Carver looked uncomfortable, the other board members shifting in their seats. Victoria continued, "I'm not taking a leave of absence. I'm not stepping down, but I am setting boundaries. My daughter comes first. If that's unacceptable to this board, then perhaps we need to have a different conversation about leadership. But I think you'll find that a CEO who has a life outside this office is actually more effective, not less. I'm making better decisions because I'm not burned out. I'm seeing opportunities you miss because I'm not living in a tunnel of exhaustion and stress." The speech was risky, bold, the kind of thing that could either solidify her position or get her ousted. But as she looked around the table, she saw something shift in several faces. Respect, understanding, maybe even admiration. One of the older board members, a man who'd been with the company since its early days, spoke up. "Victoria, I think what you're doing is exactly right. Too many of us sacrificed our families for this company. It's refreshing to see someone who refuses to make that mistake. You have my full support." Others nodded in agreement, and Richard Carver, seeing which way the wind was blowing, reluctantly backed down. The meeting continued, but Victoria felt something fundamental had changed. She'd stopped hiding her humanity behind corporate armor, and instead of weakness, it had revealed strength. When she got home that evening, she found Marcus waiting on her doorstep with takeout containers and a nervous smile. "I thought maybe you could use dinner," he said, "and someone to talk to if today was as hard as I imagined it was." Victoria felt something in her chest crack open, and suddenly she was crying, right there on her doorstep, all the stress and fear and relief pouring out. Marcus set down the food and pulled her into his arms, just holding her while she shook with silent sobs. Emma appeared at the door, her expression worried, and she ran to join the embrace, wrapping her small arms around both of them. The three of them stood there, a tangle of comfort and support, and Victoria realized this was what she'd been missing in her marriage. This instinctive care, this willingness to show up with takeout on a hard day, this understanding that strength didn't mean never breaking down. When she finally pulled herself together, she looked at Marcus through tear-streaked makeup and said, "I told the board about Emma today, about her selective mutism, about why I've been less available. And they didn't fire me." Marcus smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Of course they didn't. You're brilliant and irreplaceable, and anyone who can't see that is an idiot. Now come on, let's eat Chinese food straight from the containers and let Emma teach us whatever new visual language she's invented today." And that's exactly what they did, sitting on Victoria's expensive living room floor, eating lo mein with chopsticks, laughing at Emma's increasingly elaborate pictographic stories, being a family in all the ways that mattered even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. The crisis came on a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks into what Marcus had started thinking of as his new life. He was at home, preparing for the evening session with Emma, when his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "This is Marcus Chun," he said, tucking the phone between his ear and shoulder while he gathered his materials. "Miss Chun, this is Barbara Morrison from the State Board of Behavioral Health. I'm calling regarding a complaint that's been filed against you for practicing psychology without a license." The words hit him like ice water. His hands froze on the bag he was packing. What? There must be some mistake. I'm not practicing psychology. I'm working as a behavioral consultant under a legal agreement. The woman's voice was professionally neutral, which somehow made it worse. Chun. The complaint alleges that you've been providing therapeutic services to a minor child diagnosed with selective mutism, conducting regular sessions, and implementing treatment strategies. These activities fall under the legal definition of psychological practice in this state. The complaint was filed by a concerned citizen who believes you're operating outside the scope of legal consulting. Marcus felt his world tilting. Who filed the complaint? I can't disclose that information at this time, Morrison replied. What I can tell you is that we're required to investigate. You'll receive formal notification in the mail within 72 hours. And you'll have an opportunity to respond. In the meantime, I'd strongly advise you to cease any activities that could be construed as psychological practice until this matter is resolved. After she hung up, Marcus stood in his kitchen, phone still in his hand, feeling like he'd been punched in the gut. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of progress with Emma. 6 weeks of building something that felt like a future. And now someone had reported him. Someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had weaponized it against him. His mind immediately went to Jennifer Park, the colleague who'd warned him in the grocery store. Had she reported him out of genuine concern? Or was it someone else? Someone from Victoria's world who disapproved of their relationship? He called Victoria immediately. And the moment she heard his voice, she knew something was wrong. What happened? Talk to me. Marcus explained the call, the complaint, the investigation. Victoria's response was immediate and fierce. This is Richard Carver. It has to be. He's been making inquiries about you, about us. One of my assistants warned me yesterday, but I didn't think he'd actually do something like this. The bastard is trying to undermine me by attacking. Richard Carver was the board member who'd challenged Victoria in the meeting, the one who'd reluctantly backed down, but clearly hadn't given up his campaign to discredit her leadership. Marcus felt anger and helplessness warring in his chest. Victoria, I have to stop the sessions. If I continue and they determine I was practicing without a license, I could face criminal charges. I could lose any chance of ever getting licensed again. I could put you and Emma at risk legally. No, Victoria said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. They both knew he was right. Marcus, there has to be something we can do. We can fight this. I'll get the best lawyers. We'll show them the consulting agreement, the documentation, everything. We did this by the book. The book doesn't matter if they decide my activities constituted therapy, Marcus said, his voice hollow. And honestly, Victoria, maybe they're right. Maybe I crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed. Maybe I let my desire to help Emma override my better judgment about professional boundaries. Don't you dare, Victoria said, her voice sharp with emotion. Don't you dare second-guess what you've done for my daughter. Emma has made more progress in 6 weeks with you than in 6 months with licensed therapists. You didn't do anything wrong. You helped a child who needed help. That's not a crime. But legally it might be, Marcus said quietly. And I can't risk it. I can't risk my daughter's future. If I get charged with illegal practice, what happens to Lily? Who takes care of her if I end up facing prosecution? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Victoria knew he was right, even as everything in her rebelled against it. What do I tell Emma? She finally asked, and Marcus could hear tears in her voice. How do I explain that the person who finally helped her reach the world again is being taken away? Tell her the truth, Marcus said, though the words felt like glass in his throat. Tell her that sometimes grown-ups have complicated rules that don't make sense but have to be followed anyway. Tell her that I'm not leaving because I want to, but because I have to protect both of us from people who don't understand what we were doing. That evening, Marcus didn't go to Victoria's home for their scheduled session. Instead, he sat Lily down and explained as much as she could understand about licenses and regulations and complaints. She listened with tears streaming down her face. But Daddy, you were helping Emma. Why would someone want to stop you from helping? Because the world is complicated, sweetheart, Marcus said, pulling her close. Sometimes people use rules as weapons when they don't like what you're doing, even if what you're doing is good. Across town, Victoria had an even harder conversation with Emma. She sat her daughter down and explained that Marcus wouldn't be able to visit for a while, that there were grown-up problems that had to be worked out first. Emma's reaction was immediate and devastating. She pulled out her velvet pouch of stones and threw it across the room, the stones scattering everywhere. Then she opened her mouth and sound came out, not words but a wail of pure anguish that was somehow worse than silence. It was the sound of trust betraying her again, of safety being ripped away, of the pattern shattering just as it was starting to make sense. Victoria tried to hold her, but Emma pushed her away, running to her room and slamming the door. The sound echoed through the converted warehouse like a gunshot, and Victoria stood in the wreckage of scattered stones, feeling more helpless than she'd ever felt in her life. She called Marcus back. She's destroyed, Victoria said, her voice breaking. Marcus, she tried to scream. Actual sound came out. Progress, isn't it? That she's expressing herself verbally, even if it's a scream. It is, Marcus confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. But progress doesn't matter if I can't continue working with her. Victoria, I think you need to find a licensed therapist, someone who can take over and build on what we've started, someone who can help her the rest of the way without legal complication. No, Victoria said firmly. Emma doesn't trust other therapists. She trusts you. We'll figure this out. Give me 48 hours. I'm going to fix this. Victoria Westbrook had not built a company worth billions by accepting defeat, and she wasn't about to start now. She spent the next day and a half on the phone with lawyers, with state officials, with anyone who might be able to help navigate this bureaucratic nightmare. She learned that Marcus's situation existed in a legal gray area. Consulting wasn't the same as therapy, but the line between them was subjective and often came down to interpretation. She learned that the investigation process could take months, during which Marcus would be advised not to continue any work that might be construed as therapeutic practice. But she also learned something else. Several states had passed laws allowing unlicensed individuals to practice certain forms of mental health support under supervision of a licensed professional. If Marcus were working under the clinical supervision of a licensed psychologist documenting his work properly and having his approach reviewed regularly, it might be possible to continue legally. The problem was finding a licensed psychologist willing to supervise him, especially with an active complaint pending. Victoria made call after call, leveraging every connection she had, until finally she reached Dr. Sarah Winters, Marcus's former colleague in Boston. "Sarah, I need your help," Victoria said, explaining the situation. "I know it's a lot to ask, but would you be willing to provide clinical supervision for Marcus's work with my daughter, at least until this investigation is resolved and he can get his license reinstated?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "You realize that by supervising him, I'm putting my own license on the line if the board determines he's practicing outside appropriate bounds." "I realize that," Victoria said, "and I'm prepared to compensate you accordingly for the risk you'd be taking." "This isn't about money," Sarah said. "This is about whether I believe Marcus is helping your daughter or harming her. Tell me honestly, what kind of progress has she made?" Victoria described everything. The stones, the drawings, the emerging trust, the attempted vocalization. She described how Emma had smiled for the first time in 6 months, how she'd started communicating through art, how the walls of silence were slowly crumbling. When she finished, Sarah let out a long breath. "That sounds exactly like the Marcus I used to work with, the one who saw children instead of diagnoses. All right, I'll do it. But on one condition." "Anything," Victoria said. "Marcus has to agree to work toward getting his license reinstated. This supervision arrangement is temporary. He's too talented to spend his life in legal limbo. He needs to do the work, take the exams, rebuild his credentials properly. If he agrees to that, I'll supervise him for as long as it takes." Victoria felt hope flood through her for the first time in 2 days. "He'll agree. I'll make sure he agrees." When Victoria called Marcus with the news, his reaction was more complicated than she'd expected. There was relief, yes, but also fear. "Sarah's willing to put her career on the line for me? Why? Because she believes in you," Victoria said simply. "Because she knows what you're capable of, and because Emma needs you. We both need you. Marcus, you can't give up now, not when we're so close to something real." Marcus thought about Emma's scream, about the sound of her voice trying to break free from months of silence. He thought about Lily's tear-stained face when he'd told her he couldn't help Emma anymore. He thought about Victoria's fierce loyalty, about the way she'd fought for him without hesitation, and he thought about Elena, about what she would say if she could see him now. She'd tell him to stop running. She'd tell him to stand and fight for something that mattered. "Okay," he said finally, "I'll do it. I'll work with Sarah. I'll start the process to get relicensed. But Victoria, this means we're in it for the long haul. This isn't just a few weeks of helping Emma anymore. This is rebuilding my entire career. This is changing everything." "Good," Victoria said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I want everything to change. I want you in our lives permanently, Marcus. Not just as Emma's consultant, as my partner, as part of our family." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Marcus felt his heart do something complicated in his chest, fear and hope tangling together until he couldn't tell them apart. "I want that too," he admitted. "I'm terrified of it, but I want it." The first session under Sarah's supervision felt strange and formal after weeks of organic connection. Sarah joined them via video call, a professional presence observing from her Boston office while Marcus sat with Emma in Victoria's living room. Emma had been wary at first, confused by the new person watching them, but Marcus explained it simply. "Dr. Sarah is my teacher. She's helping me remember how to do this work the right way." And Emma, with her characteristic insight, seemed to understand that this was the price of keeping Marcus in her life. They started slowly, rebuilding trust that had been fractured by his sudden absence. Emma showed him that she'd gathered all her stones back into the velvet pouch and had added a new one, a piece of rough, broken granite that she'd found in the parking lot. Marcus understood immediately. It was her anger stone, the one that held her fury at being abandoned again, even temporarily. He didn't try to replace it with something prettier. He simply acknowledged it. "That's a powerful stone, Emma. Sometimes anger is the most honest feeling we have." Over the next 3 weeks, with Sarah's supervision and guidance, Marcus began to formally document his work in ways he never had before. He wrote detailed session notes, identified specific therapeutic goals, tracked progress using standardized measures. It was exhausting and sometimes felt like it stripped away the magic of what he and Emma had built together. But Sarah was patient and wise, helping him see that structure didn't have to mean sterility. "You've always had good instincts, Marcus," she told him during one of their supervision calls. "I'm just helping you translate those instincts into language the licensing board will understand." The real breakthrough came on a Saturday morning when all 4 of them, Marcus, Lily, Victoria, and Emma, went to the park together. It was the first time they'd ventured out as a family unit, and Marcus was acutely aware of the stares they drew. A clearly wealthy woman with a man in secondhand jeans and 2 little girls who didn't quite match. They looked like exactly what they were, a patchwork family still figuring out how the pieces fit. They were sitting on a blanket, Eating sandwiches Victoria had attempted to make herself with hilariously lopsided results when Emma did something unprecedented. She pulled Lily close and whispered directly into her ear. Lily's eyes went wide and she looked at Emma with pure delight. "You just talked to me," Lily said, her voice awed. "Emma, you used your voice." Emma nodded, looking both proud and terrified of what she'd just done. She'd spoken, not to adults, not in a formal session, but to her friend in a moment of pure spontaneity. Marcus and Victoria exchanged glances, both trying desperately not to make a big deal out of it, not to scare Emma back into silence with too much attention. Lily, bless her, understood instinctively what was needed. She simply whispered something back to Emma, creating a private world where words were safe. For the next hour, the two girls whispered to each other, secret conversations that the adults couldn't hear and didn't need to. Emma's voice was growing stronger, but it needed the safety of childhood friendship to test its wings before it could fly in the adult world. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep during a movie, Marcus and Victoria sat on her balcony overlooking the city, wine glasses in hand, processing what they'd witnessed. "She spoke," Marcus said quietly, still hardly believing it. "It's not just sound, actual words." Whispered, but words. Victoria leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, because she felt safe, because we were all there, this strange little family we've made, and she knew nothing bad would happen. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Victoria asked the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. "What happens when this is over? When Emma is fully healed and doesn't need sessions anymore? Do you disappear back to your life and I go back to mine? Do we pretend this was just a professional relationship that ran its course?" Marcus set down his wine glass and turned to face her fully. "I don't want to disappear. I don't want to pretend. Victoria, somewhere in the last 2 months, I fell in love with you. I fell in love with your fierce protection of your daughter, your vulnerability hidden behind corporate armor, the way you make terrible sandwiches but try anyway. I fell in love with Emma's resilience and her wisdom, fell in love with the life we're building together, messy and complicated as it is." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since that first night when you knelt beside my daughter and saw her instead of a problem to be solved. But Marcus, I'm scared. My marriage failed because I put work first and my husband couldn't handle being second. What if I do the same thing to you? What if my ambition destroys this too?" Marcus took her hands in his. "Your ambition isn't the problem. Your ex-husband's inability to be a partner and a parent was the problem. I'm not asking you to choose between your career and your family. I'm asking to be part of both. I want to build something where we support each other's dreams instead of competing with them. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I'm dating the CEO of Westbrook Industries. My masculinity is secure enough to be Mr. Victoria Westbrook, if that's what it takes." Victoria laughed through her tears. "I would never ask you to be Victoria Westbrook, but I might ask you to be Dr. Marcus Chun again. Sarah tells me you're making incredible progress on your re-licensing course. She says you could have your license reinstated within 6 months if you keep at this pace." The mention of his license brought Marcus back to reality. The investigation was still ongoing. Richard Carver hadn't given up his campaign against Victoria, though he'd gone quiet after the supervision arrangement was put in place. And there was still the very real possibility that the board could determine Marcus had crossed legal line, supervision or not. But for the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt ready to face that uncertainty. He'd stopped running. He'd stood his ground and fought for something that mattered. Whatever happened with the investigation, he'd already won the important battle. He'd reclaimed himself. 2 months later, the formal hearing took place. Marcus sat in a conference room at the State Board of Behavioral Health, flanked by Victoria's lawyers, with Sarah testifying via video. Richard Carver's complaint was laid out in detail, highlighting every session Marcus had conducted, every technique he'd used, arguing that these constituted psychological practice without a license. But then Sarah testified. She walked the board through the supervision arrangement, the detailed documentation, the clinical rationale for every intervention. She explained selective mutism and why traditional therapy approaches often failed. She presented Emma's progress not as miraculous healing by an unlicensed practitioner, but as evidence-based intervention under proper professional supervision. And then Victoria testified. She described her daughter's suffering, the money spent on specialists who couldn't help, the night Marcus had calmed Emma in 10 minutes when no one else could. She spoke with the passion of a mother and the precision of a CEO, dismantling every argument Carver's complaint had raised. The board deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the chairwoman's expression was unreadable. "Mir Chun, we've reviewed the evidence and testimony carefully. Your actions prior to establishing supervision with Dr. Winters existed in a gray area of our regulation. However, we find that your work was conducted in good faith, with appropriate documentation through your consulting agreement, and that once concerns were raised, you immediately sought proper supervision." She paused. "We're dismissing the complaint with a formal recommendation that you complete the process to reinstate your license within 1 year. We believe the field would benefit from your return to practice." Marcus felt Victoria's hand squeeze his under the table. He'd won. They'd won. On the courthouse steps afterward, Marcus turned to Victoria. We should celebrate. Take the girls somewhere special. Tell them we don't have to hide anymore. Victoria smiled. I have a better idea. Come with me. She drove them to her office building, the gleaming tower where Marcus had once worked nights as an invisible janitor. They rode the elevator to the executive floor, and Victoria led him to a corner office he'd cleaned 100 times. This is yours, she said, opening the door. I'm creating a new position, Director of Family Wellness Programs. You'll work with our employees' families, providing support and resources, building the kind of programs that help kids like Emma before they reach crisis points. And you'll do it with a full staff, proper licensing, and every resource you need. The office was beautiful, with windows overlooking the city and space for all his books and materials. But what made Marcus's throat tighten was the small detail he noticed on the desk, a velvet pouch filled with stones. You're hiring me? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. I'm hiring you, Victoria confirmed, but only if you're ready. Only if this is what you want. Marcus looked around the office, then back at Victoria. 6 months ago, I was mopping these floors, invisible and broken. Now I'm standing here with you, about to become part of something bigger than I ever imagined. Yes, he said. Yes to all of it. The job, the license, the life we're building. All of it. Victoria kissed him there in his new office, and through the windows they could see the city spread out before them, full of broken families and hurting children and possibilities for healings. Emma spoke her first full sentence the next week during a session. She looked at Marcus and Victoria sitting together on the couch and said, in a small but clear voice, I love my new family. The words were simple, profound, and absolutely perfect. 1 year later, Marcus stood in the conference room of Westbrook Industries' newly established Family Wellness Center, watching through the observation window as a young therapist worked with a 6-year-old boy who hadn't spoken in school for 3 months. The therapist was using stones, creating a safe space for communication without words, building bridges exactly the way Marcus had taught her. It was working. The program he'd built had already helped 43 families in its first year of operation, and the waiting list kept growing. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Don't forget, parent-teacher conference at 4. Lily's teacher says she has something important to discuss. Marcus smiled. Their lives had become beautifully chaotic, a constant juggling act of schedules and commitments and the million small details that came with being a blended family. They'd moved in together 6 months ago, buying a house in a neighborhood halfway between the expensive area where Victoria felt comfortable and the working-class area where Marcus had roots. It was compromise made physical, a home that belonged to both of their worlds. Emma attended regular school now, thriving in 3rd grade. She still had quiet days when speaking felt hard, but she had tools now. She had her stones, her art, and most importantly, she had Lily, who'd become not just her friend but her sister in every way that mattered. The girls shared a room by choice, quote, their belongings intermingled in a chaos of stuffed animals and art supplies and shared secrets. Marcus left the wellness center and drove to Lily's school, arriving just as Victoria pulled up in her sensible sedan, a far cry from the chauffeured town cars she used to favor. She'd learned that being a present mother sometimes meant carpooling and packed lunches and showing up in jeans instead of designer suits. She'd learned that power came in many forms, and the kind she wielded at home was more important than the kind she wielded in boardrooms. They walked into the school together hand in hand and found Lily's teacher waiting with a portfolio. Anderson smiled warmly at them both. Thank you for coming. I wanted to share something special with you. She opened the portfolio to reveal an essay Lily had written titled My Two Families. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he began to read. I used to have one family, Lily had written in her careful 3rd grade handwriting. It was Mommy and Daddy, and it was perfect. But then Mommy got sick and died, and our family broke. For a long time, it was just me and Daddy, and we were sad, but we had each other. Then Daddy met Victoria and Emma, and I was scared because I thought they would replace Mommy, but that's not what happened. The essay continued, describing how families could break and remake themselves into new patterns, how love didn't have to be divided but could multiply, how it was possible to honor the past while building a future. She wrote about Emma's silence and how it taught her that people communicate in different ways. She wrote about Victoria's strength and how it showed her that women could be both powerful and kind. And she wrote about her father's courage in letting himself love again after loss. Now I have 2 families, Lily concluded. I have my memory family with Mommy, which lives in my heart forever. And I have my real-life family with Daddy, Victoria, and Emma. Both families are true. Both families are mine. Love doesn't replace love. It just grows bigger. Marcus and Victoria both had tears streaming down their faces by the time they finished reading. Anderson handed them tissues with a knowing smile. Lily wanted me to share this with you. She said you needed to know that she's happy, that even though the road was hard, she wouldn't change where it led. That evening they had a family dinner, something that had become sacred in their household. No phones, no work emails, just the 4 of them around the table sharing food and stories. Emma talked about her day, her voice still quiet but growing more confident. Lily complained about math homework. Victoria shared a funny story about a board meeting. Marcus just listened, soaking in the ordinary magic of it all. After dinner, Emma pulled out her old notebook, the one where she'd created her visual dictionary in the early days of her silence. She'd kept adding to it over the year. documenting her journey in pictures. She flipped to the last page and showed them her newest drawing. It depicted 4 stick figures standing in front of a house with a large tree beside it. Above them were words in her increasingly neat handwriting. Sometimes the broken pieces make the most beautiful picture. Marcus thought about that first night when he'd found Emma surrounded by wreckage, drowning in silence. He thought about his own wreckage, the years he'd spent hiding from his gifts because he was afraid of failing again. He thought about Victoria's wreckage, a marriage that had crumbled and left her daughter voiceless. All that brokenness, all that pain had somehow led them here, to this table, to this family, to this moment of perfect, ordinary happiness. 3 months later, Marcus received his restored license in the mail. Dr. Marcus Chun, licensed clinical psychologist. The certificate felt like redemption, like proof that broken things could be made whole again. That same week, Victoria was profiled in a major business magazine, not for her corporate achievements, but for her work-life balance initiatives at Westbrook Industries. The article highlighted how she'd transformed company culture to support working parents, how she'd proven that family and success weren't mutually exclusive. And on a Saturday morning in spring, with the cherry blossoms blooming in their backyard, Marcus and Victoria got married. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, with Lily and Emma serving as joint maids of honor. The girls wore matching purple dresses and carried bouquets of wildflowers they'd picked themselves. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, Emma spoke up in her clear, strong voice. "I object to waiting any longer. Can they kiss now?" The gathered guests erupted in laughter, and Marcus and Victoria obliged, sealing their commitment with a kiss while their daughters cheered. Later, during the reception in their backyard, Marcus found himself standing alone for a moment, watching his new family dance and laugh and celebrate. Sarah Winters approached, glass of champagne in hand. "You did it," she said quietly. "You came back. You rebuilt everything you thought you'd lost." Marcus smiled, watching Lily teach Emma some complicated dance moves she'd learned at school. "I didn't rebuild it. I built something new, something different. Something that includes all the broken pieces and makes them part of the beauty instead of hiding them." Sarah raised her glass. "To beautiful broken things," she said, "to families that choose each other, to second chances and new beginnings." Marcus clinked his glass against hers and looked over at Victoria, who was laughing at something Emma had said, her head thrown back, completely unself-conscious in her joy. He thought about the hidden camera that had captured their first encounter, the footage that had changed everything. He thought about how one moment of choosing to see someone, truly see them, had cascaded into this entire new life. Emma caught his eye from across the yard and held up a stone, the original gray-blue worry stone Lily had given him so long ago. She'd carried it throughout her journey, and now she held it up like a talisman, a reminder of where they'd started. Marcus held up his own hand, showing her the new stone he carried, a piece of rose quartz Victoria had given him on the day they'd moved in together. New stones for new memories, but the old ones still treasured, still honored, still part of the pattern. As the sun set on their wedding day, the 4 of them sat together on their back porch, exhausted and happy. "What do we do now?" Lily asked, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. "Now?" Victoria said, pulling Emma close. "Now we just live. We show up for each other. We keep building this beautiful, messy, and perfect family. We keep turning our broken pieces into something worth looking at," and that's exactly what they did. Day by ordinary day, they lived and loved and built a life that proved the simple truth Emma had discovered so long ago with a kaleidoscope. The pieces didn't have to fit the way they used to. They just had to be willing to make a new pattern. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, that new pattern was even more beautiful than the original.